When was the Torah written? We continue our series on dating the Pentateuch by looking at the most relevant anachronisms we find in Exodus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Unfortunately, Leviticus lacks relevant ones. The first text is Exodus 16:35 and 36. The people of Israel ate the manna 40 years till they came to a habitable land. They ate the manna till they came to the border of the land of Canaan. An omer is the 10th part of an ephah. Such a statement could have been written only after Israel entered Canaan. We know from Joshua 5 that the manna stopped once they started eating the produce of the land. How could Moses write the statement since he died months before they entered Canaan? He couldn't. The next relevant anachronistic verse is Numbers 32:41. Jair, a descendant of Manasseh, captured their settlements and called them Havoth-Jair. Judges 10 informs us there was a judge named Jair. It could be only a name coincidence were it not for the fact that this judge ruled in Gilead, was a descendant of Manasseh, and the same name is given to the settlements he captured, Havoth-Jair. A reference to the same name and person is made in Deuteronomy 3. Jair, a descendant of Manasseh, took the whole region of Argob as far as the border of the Geshurites and Maacathites. It was named after him so that to this day Bashan is called Havoth-Jair. Joshua 13 also mentions Havoth-Jair. A judge of Israel explicitly mentioned in the book of Judges is also mentioned in Numbers and Deuteronomy. We don't really know when he judged, but it was certainly after the conquest of Canaan. I remind you, Moses couldn't have written about events happening long after he died. Numbers 32 flows naturally as text, while in Deuteronomy 3 it's mentioned in a parenthetical manner. Deuteronomy especially has many parenthetical glosses written in the middle of Moses' speeches. We notice this because there is a first-person discourse, and then we have some explanations and comments inserted regarding something Moses was addressing. Another similar example would be Deuteronomy 2. Moses mentions Moab in verse 9, and then the next 3 verses are a summary of how land ownership changed in the region. Once the parenthesis is over, Moses continues his direct speech in the first person. In this gloss, the editor says in verse 2, "As Israel did to the land of their possession which the Lord gave to them." This is a clear allusion to the Israelite conquest of Canaan. If verses 10 to 12 would be dropped, the text would flow naturally without the editorial interruption. We see such editorial glosses in Numbers as well. Deuteronomy seems to have the most, or at least they're the most obvious here, because of the changes from direct to indirect speech or from the first person to the third person. Some modern translations put these glosses in parentheses while others don't. Another similar anachronistic note is only a few verses later, Deuteronomy 2:20-23. Again, the editor is giving insight in the territorial changes that happened in the past. Among these peoples are the Caphtorites that captured the villages of the Avites. Caphtor is the Hebrew name for the island of Crete. The Avites lived around Gaza, which we know was Philistine land. Joshua 13:3 mentions the 5 Philistine cities in connection with the Avites, and Genesis 10:14 mentions the Caphtorites right after the Philistines. They were part of the sea peoples that conquered the coastal land around Gaza. The Bible puts all these ethnic groups in one bucket and calls them according to the name of the strongest group, the Philistines. Around 10 ethnic groups can be identified as sea peoples according to Egyptian sources. Remember, sea peoples is a modern term, not an ancient one. Among them were the Peleset, the ones that give the biblical name to the Philistines. Ramses III mentions the sea peoples invading Egypt, but defeats them in sea battles in his 8th year. Eric Klein has a bombastic title for one of his most popular books, 1177, The Year Civilization Collapsed. William Albright proposed that it was around this time that they settled in the coastal land of Canaan. The role of the sea peoples in the Bronze Age collapse is very much debated, but that is not the aim of our discussion. If the Philistines settled in Canaan around 1177 BC, they weren't settled in Canaan neither during early nor late Exodus dates. And surely, they weren't in Canaan at the time of Abraham and Isaac, a problem I addressed in our previous video about Genesis anachronisms. This does not pose a problem if we accept parts of the Torah were written after Moses died. There is no other way to take these verses. There is a long period between the Philistine settlement and the monarchy, the period I propose for the final form of the Torah. Is Genesis 36:31 the only monarchical anachronism, or do we have others? I'm glad you asked. I will present to you the greatest, most historically loaded anachronism in the whole Bible. Numbers 13:22. Remember it. Numbers 13 describes the episode when Israel goes to scout Canaan and they get scared of the Canaanites. As the 12 scouts trip is described, Hebron is mentioned as one of the cities they passed by. They went up through the Negev and came to Hebron, where Ahiman, Sheshai, and Talmai, the descendants of Anak, lived. The verse doesn't stop here. We also have a parenthetical note about Hebron. It was built 7 years before the city of ZOAN in Egypt. Why do I think this is the greatest anachronism in the whole Bible? Let me unpack it for you. ZOAN is the biblical name for Tanis. It became the Egyptian capital of the 21st dynasty. This dynasty inaugurates the third intermediate period. Mendes ascends to power after the death of Ramses XI. He moved the capital from Ramses to Tanis around 1069 BC, give or take. It's true that Tanis is attested during the reign of Ramses II, the 13th century, but its name became important and internationally known after it became the capital of Egypt. It's interesting that Psalm 78 places the Exodus events in the fields of ZOAN. The author of the psalm is identified as Asaph, the grandson of Samuel and a contemporary of David. We therefore can know that Psalm 78 was written in the 10th century BC. Asaph was aware that the events of the Exodus happened not far from Tanis, and he updates the toponym of the Egyptian capital. I find it fascinating that Tanis and Ramses, two Egyptian capitals, are mentioned in Numbers. Pyramesses became the capital of Egypt in the 1270s and Tanis in the 1060s BC. When the editor of Numbers makes a gloss to make a chronological point, he uses the name ZOAN. Why does the editor feel the need to compare the chronology of Hebron with Tanis? What is the significance? We need to understand the importance of these two cities. They were more than cities. Both were capitals. Hebron was the capital of Israel during the first 7 years of David's reign. It was God himself that told David to move to Hebron once he became king over Judah. Judah and Israel were in a civil war the first 2 years of his reign. It was the most significant city in Judah until Jerusalem eclipsed it in the 10th century. It held military, political, historical, and religious importance. Hebron was one of the 3 escaped cities chosen on the western side of the Jordan. It was initially split between the clan of Caleb and the Levites. Not just Levites inhabited it, but the sons of Aaron, the only priests that were allowed to serve inside the temple. Only the tribes of Benjamin and Judah had the privilege of being inhabited by Aaronites. Hebron is the most prominent of the 9 places of worship and theophany mentioned in Genesis, according to Bergsma. The oaks of Mamre and Machpelah cave were in Hebron. Sarah lived and died here. It was here that Sarah, Abraham, Isaac, Rebekah, Jacob, and Leah were buried. It's where the angels informed Abraham he would have a son, where God informed him of Sodom's fate, and where he bargained with God to save it. So, going back to our question, what can we read into this comparison between Hebron and Tanis? It could indicate the editor is making a comparison between 2 capitals, the capitals of Egypt and Israel at the time he is writing. If so, this would place the writing of Numbers during the first 7.5 years of David's rule. The editor wants to point to the superiority of their capital because it's older. Older was always better for the ancient people. Given the bad blood between the Israelites and the Egyptians, showing superiority in any significant or insignificant way is to be desired. One might think that Hebron, known as Kiriath Arba, goes back to the time of Abraham. That's what Genesis says indeed. We don't really know when the name was changed from Kiriath Arba to Hebron. It could have happened at the time of the conquest or later. At the same time, we need not read these verses as referring to the very beginning of the existence of these cities. According to Nadav Naaman, the editor is referring to a major rebuilding and reinforcing program that turned both into capitals. If the year the editor has in mind for Tanis is 1069 BC, it means Hebron went through a major rebuilding program around 1076 BC. This was the time of the judges, a time when the Philistines were at their strongest. It was just a few decades before Saul ruled and was killed by the Philistines. The longest border the Philistines had with any Israelite tribe was with Judah. Hebron was the most important city in the tribe of Judah. It was Judah's de facto capital. It needed to stand strong against the Philistines. Judges 16 tells us it was near Hebron where Samson brought the gates of Gaza. As I mentioned in our last video, Genesis 36:31 places the writing of the book during the monarchy. Numbers 13:22 indicates a date during David's first 7 years. However, there are ifs in the argument. Therefore, a more secure dating range would be the reign of Saul through David's 7th year. Unfortunately, the length of Saul's reign is not clear in 1 Samuel. Roughly speaking, the time span we are looking at is approximately 1050 to 1000 BC, according to the classical timeline attributed to David and Saul. We can say with certainty that the mentioning of Tanis reinforces the argument that the Torah was finalized during the early United Monarchy. This timeline can also be argued for by what is not written in the text. John Bergsma makes some good points about the elephant not in the room of the documentary hypothesis. The absent elephant is the following, quote, "We see in the Pentateuch not a single occurrence of the toponym Zion, or Jerusalem, the name David, or even the word temple. The absence of Jerusalem was a point I made in my last video, which I recorded over 6 months ago. My conclusion was based on only reading the biblical text. In the meantime, I read Bergsma's observations, which were identical to mine regarding Jerusalem. He emphasizes that the Psalms of David's time are soaked with Zion theology, yet there is not one reference to Zion in the Pentateuch. That's why I postulate David's 7th year is the terminus antiquem. The same 3 types of anachronisms we mentioned in Genesis can be seen especially in Deuteronomy and Numbers. Moses' death in Deuteronomy 34 is the most obvious one. He couldn't have written about his own death. Almost everyone accepts that Moses' death was inserted afterwards. Kenneth Kitchen calls it the absolutely cast iron post-Mosaicum in the text. Not only Moses' death is mentioned, but his death place, Joshua's future leadership, and the fact that no leader as great as Moses arose afterwards. This indicates a long time passed. If a whole chapter is accepted as not being written by Moses, this means it has already been established that Moses didn't write 100% of the Torah. There are many more clues in the text beyond the anachronistic ones. Moses couldn't have written about himself as being the meekest on the face of the earth, or that the Egyptians and the Israelites feared him. Do all these anachronisms mean Moses didn't write the Torah? No. There are parts that aren't Mosaic, but there are many arguments to show primary documents from the time of Moses were used and quoted in the composition of the Pentateuch. The Torah is essentially or substantially Mosaic, and the anachronisms are real. Both can be true. This is what I will argue for in our next video. Please hit the like button to help our channel grow, and don't forget to subscribe.